The following program deals with a controversial subject. The theories expressed are not the only possible interpretation. Viewers are invited to make a judgment based on all available information.
This is your captain speaking. We are beginning our descent into madness.
Open your mind.
And we're back to another edition of West of the Rockies. I'm Frank. Thank you guys for sticking around. I know it's late, but boy, we have a definitely a great show lined up for everyone tonight. Genevieve, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you tonight?
I'm really excited to have our guest. He had been on the show a while back.
This was long overdue, definitely.
Yeah, we spoke about Eyes Wide Shut, one of my all-time favorite movies, because I have a morbid fascination with things. And it's one of those movies that you feel like they're telling you more than they're letting on, right?
Yeah, it's like in your face, and you just want to know what.
Yeah, it's just you just don't know how to translate.
You know it's there.
Yeah,
you know it's there. It's just like, come on, guys, we just need to peel back the layers here.
Yeah, and I came across Jay's website where he has analyses on numerous films. And
more than numerous, yeah.
To say the least. And, we're lucky enough to get him on the show. And if you missed it, go check out our website, WOTRradio.com. We have the interview there. It was definitely a really cool interview. And Genevieve, without further ado, I will let you do the introduction.
Tonight, we've got Dyer on the show. He's a real gem in the world of all things conspiracy in Hollywood. His approach to analysis is interesting and fun, whilst always remaining thorough and mind-expanding, in my opinion. Jay has written on a myriad of topics in movies, with a select few of the most important themes in films being mentioned in his recently published Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. And that's exactly what we'll be exploring tonight during our show. And having focused on Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut in our last interview, this time round we'll be delving into the depths of dark and murky Hollywood on a wider level, investigating exactly what the medium of film is trying to achieve and how it is doing so. Movies may be entertainment for the masses, but look a little further and we find a world of power, control, and indoctrination. And Dyer is here to elucidate some of this world for us tonight. We welcome Dyer of Jay's Analysis onto the show.
Jay, can you hear us okay?
I can. How are you?
We're doing great. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight and talk about your book, Esoteric Hollywood. Last time you were on the show, you mentioned it. You were still finalizing the book a bit. And now that it's out, what's the reception been like? I took a little stroll through Amazon and saw that the reviews are quite favorable.
Yeah, I think I have 20 5-star reviews and 1 2-star review. So that's over 95%. So that's pretty positive, I would say. All the feedback that I've gotten personally is great. People think that it's more of a textbook. It's almost like a kind of a total, removal of the veil. Actually, a lot of people are saying that. So that makes me happy. It wasn't really about money per se. This is not the kind of book that you're going to make a whole lot of money from. Mm-hmm. So, certainly making a decent amount helps, but it's the kind of book that, I just really wanted to use to help people see through lies and deception and indoctrination. And I think it does do that. And everybody seems to be responding as if that is the case. So, I just wanted to always write about movies, and thank God, here it is. It finally came into being.
Yeah, no, and it's a really, really cool book. It's really well researched. There's a ton of footnotes, the sidebars with some very pertinent information. You give a lot of background, which I think it's key. I have a lot of friends, and sometimes we get into this topic, and it's really hard for people to understand because unless you have all this information at hand, they're going to look at you like you're a little bit crazy, but you really went to great lengths to make sure that this book is backed up. Did you find that to be difficult?
Not really, just because I have always enjoyed researching and documenting. And, if you do if you do an undergraduate in philosophy, you're going to have to do a lot of that anyway. So you're going to be writing hundreds of pages worth of research papers throughout your undergraduate period. And then as you do grad school, you're going to have to write even more, probably twice that. So, having already done a whole bunch of writing in my college period, I was just sort of acclimated to doing it. And then I was just blogging and kind of on my own for fun for a long time. So most of the book was already written before it went to print, but it did require, a good bit of going back and sort of revising and adding in new information, adding in all the footnotes, and then, as you mentioned, all the sidebars. So that was a very tedious process. Yes, it took a long time. It took several months, actually, to get it all into the form that it is now. And it's not perfect. There's some aspects of it that I wish were better, but it's good enough, I think, for my sort of rookie debut outing book-wise. I'm happy with it. And, it's done better than I expected. I had no idea really what to expect. And it's only been out officially, I guess, about a month. So I'm very happy with all the reception and the sales. And it's a labor of love, I guess. And to see this kind of thing come together, it's very satisfying.
I bet. I'm telling you, we really enjoyed reading the book. It was really easy to read. And I mean that obviously in a good way. I don't think the book is dumbed down in any way, but I think that the way that it's written and the way it walks you through
the way it flows.
Yeah, it's definitely makes it really easy to read. But let me ask you this. What was the criteria for selecting which movies made it into the book? Obviously, there's millions of films out there. How did you go about picking, like, okay, this one definitely is going to make it, this one not so much?
It was pretty arbitrary, actually, in terms of just my own will. And I had to just kind of pick what movies I thought were significant and what directors. I had to figure out how to organize it and how many there would be. I had to leave out quite a bit. There was so many that I'd already written and that I wanted to do that never made it into the book. So hopefully there will be a sequel, given the success of the initial book. But it was just kind of, I thought, well, the best way to organize an introduction or a part one of this kind of a thing would just be to pick maybe 4 or 5 seminal directors and, the films of theirs that I had already pretty much dissected and watched, countless times over the years, even growing up with some of the kids era stuff, 70s and 80s, like fantasy dystopia stuff. And, part of it was stuff that I researched in my grad school era with Ian Fleming and James Bond. So it was really just a decision based on directors who were seminal and the works that were seminal and the ones that I felt like really had a lot of predictive programming or were in some way specifically pedagogically relevant to our modern day. Predictive programming, especially with, transhumanism and AI and all that kind of stuff, I felt was very important. And I mean, who can deny the influence of Kubrick? I mean,
right.
That's why he's the first 80 or 90 pages of the book. So it's really just more, I guess, common sense criteria by which I organized it. Gotcha.
And there's a term used, and I believe it's a term coined by Kenneth Anger in the book when referring to the entertainment industry here in Southern California, specifically Hollywood, of course. And that's, he compares it to the Babylonian Empire. Could you elaborate a little bit about that? How is the entertainment industry seen in this way? Because a lot of people take it as a very harmless thing, right? Movies is the kind of thing you go with the family to the theater and enjoy it or, whatever, stream it on Netflix. How can we explain to folks that maybe don't see the darker side of the entertainment industry why it's referred to this Babylonian Empire?
Well, because I cite at the beginning, a comparative religion scholar named Dudley Young, I cite his famous, it's kind of Carl Jungian tradition book, Origins of the Sacred, The Ecstasies of Love and War. And I talk about how he says that the earliest gods were invoked by ritual act, and that would be through sacrificial dance or plays, so the arts. And so from the earliest days of I guess, where we would derive our artistic tradition, the Greek mythology, Greek theater. This goes back to this whole idea of religious invocation. And so in the ancient medieval mind, theater was combined with the religious. And so I approached the whole thing from a religious standpoint. And I think that that's probably what was most surprising to people, that it's approaching Hollywood from a religious and philosophical perspective. So it's not some kind of goofy fundamentalist Baptist type approach or anything stupid like that. It's more of a scholarly academic approach, but also a religious philosophical approach. And so I don't think anyone else does that in the same way that I do. I mean, you have websites out there that'll say, oh, here's a, all-seeing eye in a movie, therefore it's Illuminati or something like that. But they don't ever approach it, looking at comparative religion or this or that. Yeah. Sometimes in college circles or in maybe film magazines or film journals, you'll get that kind of approach. Roger Ebert will do that every now and then. But if you read a Roger Ebert approach to a film, even if he talks about symbolism, he's never going to talk about cults or the occult or, history or any of that kind of stuff. He's just going to keep it on kind of that college professor level type of thing. So I've always felt that was very limiting. And I took a bunch of film classes in college, and we would get into this kind of stuff. And I'd always be bringing up, the religious aspects of a film or the occult aspects or even the conspiratorial aspects of it. Like, I remember one time we had a class on Oliver Stone's Nixon, and we were talking about the scene where Robert McNamara's eyes turned black and he starts reciting William Butler Yeats's poem about the beast. And I'm like, well, this is a reference to Crowleyism. And the professor's like, oh, what are you talking about? What is that? Well, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just like, well, obviously you don't know what I'm talking about, but I know what I'm talking about. So I always felt like, ever since that class, it was probably 10 years ago when I had that class, that I could, this kind of stuff could actually be a book one day. And lo and behold, 10 years later, it's a book. So what is Hollywood Babylon? Well, this is this older idea. I'm kind of loosely building on the Kenneth Anger approach. And Anger, of course, was a vocal Crowleyan, Luciferian, when he talked about Hollywood as this sort of dark empire, this pagan Babylonian empire. And that's roughly what David Lynch is talking about in his very bizarre, very surrealist, very abstract film Inland Empire. So that's what I started out with, was talking about these parallels and how it is kind of a religion, Hollywoodism. Whether we acknowledge it consciously or not, the public views it that way, and they treat it the same way that the average Greek citizen, 2,000-3,000 years ago would have treated the plays of Sophocles or something. Yeah. Right. Antigone, right? I mean, these are full of the gods and all this kind of stuff, or Homer or Odysseus or whatever. So that's what I went into. The first chapter was just kind of comparing the Kenneth Anger approach, and his book's dated. I mean, nobody even cares about W.C. Fields or any of these people that populate half the people in Hollywood Babylon. Nobody even knows or remembers anymore. So that book was very dated. And what I wanted to do was loosely, as I said, in the same vein and something more updated, but traversing far more landscapes than anything that Kenneth Anger would do, because he's only going to be talking about scandals and sex stories and this kind of tabloidy stuff. You're not going to get anything like what I talk about in my book. So it's a lot more depth. I'm going into Renaissance ideas of the masked ball and how this plays into Eyes Wide Shut. And I'm going to go, we talked about that about 6 months ago. I'm going to go into the history of Laurel Canyon and, based on Dave McGowan's work, and ritual murders like Black Dahlia and all this kind of stuff. So I just tried to take it to a whole other level in this very fringe, very niche market of conspiracy film analysis. There's not a lot of people that do that.
That is very true. Before we go more in depth into some of these films and start breaking down some of these ideas, you open up the book with, it's really a fascinating quote by Orson Welles, talking about filmmaking essentially as a ritual. And I guess my question is, how are we supposed to take that quote? Is it a literal quote? Is filmmaking a form of ritual to make some type of reality manifests itself? Or how do we take this quote about filmmaking as a ritual?
Well, in the case of Orson Welles, I think if you watch his famous mockumentary, F for Fake, he plays a magician in that, and he tells you that he's faking you out. So I think in his mind, he probably viewed it as the Wizard of Oz sort of scenario, the man behind the curtain, this kind of stuff. And he sees himself in the role of a trickster. So I'm not an expert on Orson Welles. I know that he, obviously had some connections to the deep state with the War of the Worlds psychological operation and all that. And also think he, probably really did make some oligarchs mad, like William Randolph Hearst. Right. Citizen Kane is parodying him. And so I think he really probably pissed that guy off. He definitely had some career struggles after that. But my guess would be that Orson Welles probably took it in a very tongue-in-cheek sense, and that Orson Welles probably, I don't have any evidence that he was like a Kabbalist or anything like that, but he could be, I don't know. But I take a different view. I take the view that both of those things can be true. You can have a Wizard of Oz type scenario where you have a man behind the curtain and Hollywood functioning kind of like Oz. I argue that in the book. And at the same time, you can have a sense in which magic is real in the sense of like the third law of Arthur C. Clarke, that magic is indistinguishable from any sufficiently advanced technology. So, if you mean by magic, like you said, sort of causing something to come to be based on your will and intention, then I guess that exists, because fiction has this reflective, circular, symbiotic relationship between itself and reality, where the fiction influences people in the real world, and then the real people in the real world then reflect back into fiction. So in a Platonic sense, I would say, quote, magic could be considered real.
Talking about magic, you mentioned an individual, and I apologize if I butcher the name here, but I believe it's Konstantin Stanislavski, and he was the father of method acting, if I remember.
Acting, right.
Interestingly enough, in your book, you explained that he was an occult practitioner who was pretty open about the spiritual nature to his method. Now, a few years back, we all remember, the smash hit at the box office. There was The Dark Knight. And Heath Ledger, everybody said that his role as the Joker was the one that ultimately broke him. Do you see something like that happening? I mean, we hear so many stories when we talk about these things about actors that submerge themselves in their role. I mean, Johnny Depp has said that he can't even watch his own movies because,
he says he doesn't go to his own premieres and watch them. Yeah.
So is there, in your opinion, are some of these actors, whether willingly or not, tapping into some type of spiritual realm, not necessarily in a positive way?
Absolutely. In fact, as I mentioned a minute ago, Plato has a dialogue called Ion, I-O-N, where Socrates debates this very subject with a bunch of musicians and poets and thinkers. And he basically argues that poets and musicians are lesser on the philosophical importance totem pole because they're inspired by the daemon, or they're inspired by a kind of Dionysian madness in a way that the philosopher or the mathematician or the Pythagorean is not. Now, granted, Socrates would say that he's inspired by a daemon as well, and this is not meaning a demon; it just means a spirit or god in the generic sense.
Okay,
but that's the Greek word daemon means that. Doesn't mean demon. So this is the ancient view of the arts, of acting. So Stanislavski's method would find resonance in Platonism. You also had Renaissance actors and actresses who would try to mimic this methodology. I actually interviewed a girl who was an actress and a model, and I think she did her master's or PhD work, I forget what, on the Renaissance method of acting. So there's a lot of parallels with this, and So Stanislavski didn't just sort of invent this. He was hearkening back to these older ideas of stage and theater, going back to ancient Greece. So now one could debate exactly what's going on here. And I'm sure that there's a million different opinions on this, but, and even in ancient Greece, you would have these sort of drug cults, and presumably the people who participated in theater were, quote, inspired under the influence of various narcotics or hallucinogens or whatever. Now, this could produce either real alternate personalities or inspirations or spiritual influences, or if one takes a more, quote, rational, skeptical approach, it's just a manifestation of madness and, as I said, sort of Dionysian berserkerness. I don't know, making up new words here, but so regardless, though, that is the ancient view, right? Regardless,
right.
So in that sense, I would say Stanislavski is just hearkening back to that. And if I recall, he was influenced by things like theosophy and things like that. So my personal view, I tend to think that there are real alternate personalities, and that they people under the influence and use of drugs and hallucinogens and whatnot, that they actually do receive an influence from what we might call a spiritual realm. So I do believe that's all real. So, but regardless, yes. Simply put, yes.
I wanted to ask, how did you initially become interested in philosophy? And secondarily, how did you come to find yourself exploring such esoteric themes, especially as pertains to film and Hollywood? So if you'd like to give an overview, really, of how you got into this.
Yes, actually, probably would be a bit of a surprise, I think, for most people who get interested in philosophy. It's because they want to, maybe when they're 18, 19, 20, rebel against maybe like a biblical upbringing or some sort of Christian upbringing or fundamentalist upbringing. For me, it was kind of the opposite. I was reading the Bible actually when I was 18, 19, and that got me interested in philosophy, because some of the church groups that I attended back then in my younger days were they were actually pro-philosophy. So they had a very open approach to the idea of that beliefs needed to be supported with some kind of argumentation, and that it's not rational or reasonable, even for a person who has a religious view, to just sort of adopt a view arbitrarily or ad hoc or anything like that. You need to have reasons for your beliefs, and that always seemed sensible to me. So when I was about 18 or 19, I just started getting into reading some philosophy and reading some Aristotle and some Plato, and then various things happened in my life that led me to going to the state university, and really the only thing that they offered that was anywhere near my interest and tastes was just philosophy. So that's what I decided to do, was get a philosophy degree. And I was working full time at the time, so it took me several years to finish the undergrad. I think about 7 or 8 actually. But at the same time, I had this great job back in my 20s where I could just sit and read all day. So for like 10 years, all I did was read all day. And then when I got off work or whatever, I'd go to class. So I wasn't just reading philosophy. I was also reading a lot of theology, a lot of comparative religion, and a lot of argumentation from other positions too. So I was always very open to trying to understand an opponent's position. Mm-hmm. And I think that's always been the strong point for why I respect and would call myself a philosopher, is that your goal is to understand, say, an opponent's position better than the opponent knows it. That's the goal, at least, right? So I was always open to reading atheists. I would read, so-called evil people or whoever. I would read fascists. I would read neo-fascists. I would read liberals. I'd read communists. I'd read Marxists. I'd read anybody. And I think that that's the most sensible way to approach things as a philosopher. And that eventually, just happened to kind of coincide with my interest in things like conspiracies and world government and 9/11 and secret societies and Freemasonry. And then I've also always liked movies and doing comedy and so forth. So you start to realize, like I was about 17 or 18, I started realizing, hey, actually, there's a lot of stuff in movies that's pretty weird. It seems to match up at times to reality, and then also seems to skew things at times. So something's going on with Hollywood. I had a suspicion for a long time, but I never could really put my finger on it until, I got much older and I'd been exposed to a lot more ideas and gotten, a really good grounding in philosophy and, actual literal professional training in philosophy. And then I think that kind of just accidentally sort of everything fell into place.
And going back to what we were talking about before a little, to what extent do you feel that actors are not merely acting? And I think this is really important because this is something you do focus on, if not explicitly, this is what really you're talking about in your book. To what extent are they not acting, but in actuality doing the thing that they're doing? And this, for me, it harks back to 2004 when in Harvard, apparently they wanted to carry out this satanic mass, and they said they were just acting out a satanic mass. But to me, acting out a satanic mass is, to an extent, doing a satanic mass. Mm-hmm. So, how does that translate into acting? And what can you tell us about how acting blurs into reality?
Well, I guess partly it would depend upon the individual actor's view of what they're doing and how serious what they're doing is. So I've never personally done any method acting. I have done a little bit of acting here and there, but I have interviewed people who studied method acting, and they claim to take it seriously. So my guess would be that, when you're watching somebody like Jared Leto or Christian Bale, losing significant amounts of weight or gaining significant amounts of weight, or Jeremy Irons, trying to literally live this persona, this role day in and day out as their, quote, craft, the acting craft, I would say that those people take it seriously. And there was always this sort of legend about Jack Nicholson telling Heath Ledger to beware of playing the role of the Joker. And I would suggest that there's probably some truth to that, because you're literally trying to put your mind into a state of chaotic evil. I mean, that's really what the Joker represents, is just mindless sort of chaotic evil. And I think Heath Ledger, if I recall, was definitely trying to practice method acting in that way in regard to that role. So I would say that those kinds of approaches can be very dangerous. And that's actually what Plato was warning against in Ion when he was arguing in that dialogue. He says this is, people go nuts. I mean, right. If you're trying to, so I would say there's a lot of reality and danger there. And that's actually when it does tie into real occultism, that would be because a lot of people who get into really practicing that stuff, they kind of go crazy. I mean, just look at the character of Crowley himself. I mean, that he ends up basically insane and a drug fiend, and like he thinks he's a god, and then he's dying and he's on drugs, and so he viewed his life that way, unless one thinks he was just strictly a British secret intelligence agent and that was all fake. I tend to think he was really believing, at least to some degree, what he was doing. And people, they get into this stuff, sometimes they end up going crazy, and that's Plato saw that same tendency amongst actors, because it's no different than this sort of hedonistic approach of the rock star. You know what I mean? I'm not now. I think that probably some of these rock stars are killed, or the deaths are staged to sell records or something like that. I think that's all possible, but I also think that you just have people living a totally out of control, dissolute lifestyle, and they're on drugs, and you're gonna die young if you live that way. Right. And I've seen people die young from drugs, so it's very reasonable to presume that.
Tell the folks at home about, and I found this really interesting. Lookout Mountain Film Studio. That place, I heard a bit about it before, and it pops up in your book. Just briefly, I'll say this much, that it was used by the U.S. Air Force. It was a top secret film studio during the 40s and the 60s. And now, interestingly enough, you just mentioned him, Jared Leto owns this place. Why don't you tell people a little bit about that? Because this connection is going to be very crucial to your book and how we interpret some of these films. So why don't you tell people a little bit about Lookout Mountain Film Studios and why that is relevant to what we're going to be talking about tonight?
Well, the last time that you had me on, I had just gone to it. So,
oh, really?
Yeah, we drove to LA and we went to Hollywood. We drove up up Mulholland Drive to Wonderland Avenue. And I took a picture, actually 2 or 3 pictures from the outside of it. Obviously, Jared Leto didn't let me in. I guess he was he was being the new Joker. So here we are back to the Joker again in Suicide Squad. But from the outside, from the little skinny road there, you can see memorabilia, plaques, and signs that still designate it as property of the Air Force. So that's all true.
Wow.
It's mainstream news. We were in the area and I wanted to go check it out with my own eyes. And yeah, that's all true. I had most of the book written and I wasn't aware of this. And then I had my buddies, Chris and John, who do Hoaxbusters, kind of clued me into this. And it was about a year ago and I read, Dave McGowan's book, and Dave, I think, was the first researcher to really clue into this because he watched, I think it's From Trinity to Trinity and Beyond, or whatever that documentary is that talks about the supposed atomic footage. And the atomic footage was all collated and edited and put together at Lookout Mountain Studios. So, the question arises, why does the Air Force need its own private film studios when, they could have conceivably, if the story about the atomic bombs and all that is what we're told, why do you need all this super secret giant film studio? And that's what it was. Like, they could have just filmed it and put it out, right? I mean, why does it all need to be processed with all these Hollywood people when the military has plenty of capable people on their own that could have done it? Well, that's because there's probably a much greater connection between Hollywood and the Pentagon than most of us are aware. And that's kind of one of the big theses I have in the book, is that there's a much closer relationship between the Pentagon and the CIA and the intelligence agencies and all that than merely some liaison office, right? I mean, everybody's kind of clued into, if you're not aware of it, all the military branches have a, quote, liaison office with Hollywood. And this is part and parcel of things like, if Michael Bay wants to put a battleship in a movie, he's going to go talk to the Navy liaison, right? And they're going to hash this out or whatever. And so the Hollywood wants to do a thing about the CIA, where they're going to go talk to Milt Bearden or Chase Brandon, who are these CIA consultants to Hollywood. Or maybe Robert Bayer. But I think it goes deeper than that. And I think that when we look back to things that somebody like Dave McGowan has clued into and focused on, like Lookout Mountain, what you see is that a lot of the top Hollywood people were mysteriously accessing and going to and filming things at this secret Air Force studio. People like Walt Disney, Jimmy Stewart, Cary Grant, Marilyn Monroe, a lot of these A-listers from 50s and 60s. Why is this happening? And we don't have all the answers. We don't know exactly everything that was going on. It was all classified. But I think it's just suggestive. It's a piece of evidence that's suggestive within a larger narrative that I argue for in my book, that basically, as the last chapter says, there's kind of a dark marriage between the Hollywood and the CIA. Correct.
Jay, why don't we start moving into the arena of films? And obviously, as you mentioned, the book opens with one of the masters of cinema, if I'm free to use the term, and that's obviously Stanley Kubrick. We dedicated a whole show to Eyes Wide Shut, and you could probably talk a lot more just on that movie alone. But I want to talk about another movie that really got a lot of people's wheels turning a bit, and that's The Shining. There's people that have speculated that this was some type of admission about Kubrick and the lunar landing and faking that footage. And mind you, part of me wants to believe it, but I'm waiting for something with a little bit more meat to really go out on a limb and say that happened. But in your book, you include an interesting photograph. And this is just a small evidence of the interesting circles that Kubrick moved in. There's a photograph in which he's walking next to Arthur C. Clarke, who, he was an astronomer, of a very bright individual. And I believe in the book, you call him an illuminist. And he's also walking alongside NASA administrator George Mueller. So Kubrick had access to some very powerful people. And I can see how that can feed into the conspiracy of Kubrick being involved in the moon landing. However, when you tackle The Shining in your book, you really start peeling back the layers and you tap on something that I guess I had toyed with the idea before, but I had not connected the two. And that's the idea that Kubrick is actually telling us the history of the U.S. We see a lot of Native American imagery, mixed in with, the modern man and, the industrialized world. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because and this is just my opinion, but I've always wondered, you hear so many stories about Native American land and some weird occurrences that happen in Native American land. And I've always wondered, could it be that maybe, as their land was being taken away, was this land being almost cursed or something? We have the case, for example, of Skinwalker Ranch, where the legends of the natives go way back to weird things happening. So how do you see The Shining? Can you explain people at home just briefly a little bit of how it might not just be, or it might not be at all about faking the lunar landing, but it could be about something a little bit closer to home, if you will?
Yeah, well, it's, as everybody knows, Stephen King's story. So there's quite often in Stephen King stories that Native American ghost tale type stuff, right? So, I mean, that I don't think that's anything revolutionary. That's, I think, pretty obvious in Stephen King stuff. And I think that the indigenous animistic spiritualism is pretty much in the background of the whole movie. And that's what we're dealing with on multiple levels. So the Overlook Hotel and its proprietor, the Stuart Ullman guy or whatever his name is, he represents that American managerial corporate class, maybe the bourgeoisie, and he describes America as this the Overlook Hotel as this resting place for the jet set, and that the elites and the royals would come and have their orgies and parties there. And so Jack seems to kind of be mystically drawn to this place. And we discover that he is, of course, abusing his son, Danny, and that this has resulted in the split of Danny having the alternate personality of, what is it, Tony, right?
Yeah.
And so I just always saw it as just kind of a ghost story and a story of possession, and an allegorical critique of American imperialism and American adventurism in terms of foreign policy and bombing other countries. That's kind of what that young adventurous generation is, what Danny represents. And that's why Jack has these weird lines like, well, Danny, did you finish bombing all the other countries? When he's playing video games.
Right.
So I think these kinds of things are clues, and Jack kind of represents that, I don't know, war generation or baby boomer generation or something. And he's very psychopathic. He's very messed up. Maybe he was abused too. He has these sort of homoerotic tendencies. We know he's looking at a Playgirl magazine. And I think that we actually eventually see him sexually abusing Danny. I believe that's hinted at. in the film. We don't see that, thankfully,
Right.
and I think that you also have this mythological aspect to it where the lookout maze is very similar to and hearkening to the story of Theseus. And this is, the idea of Minos, the king of Crete. He puts Theseus, imprisons him in the maze, and then the Minotaur is going to eat him. And so Jack sort of takes on this persona of the Minotaur, and he's going to kill his son. And point being that American bourgeois imperialism is willing to sacrifice its children for its own status in the so-called elite, because that's Jack's whole motivation, is that he feels he's been cheated. His family's holding it back. He should have been one of the great writers. He should have been at this, glorious ball with all the aristocrats and the oligarchs or whatever. And so that's how I see it. I see it as a big kind of just a story of possession. I do think there's references to mind control, and you see posters that say Monarch when you see the twins and all kinds of stuff like this, which I think is kind of hinting at mind control. And that's not far-fetched, given the fact that you've got Kubrick doing a whole movie about MK Ultra, called Clockwork Orange, right, based on the Anthony Burgess novel, and you've got another movie that deals with mind control by Kubrick, Full Metal Jacket. I think it's very likely that we see mind control and alternate personalities in Monarch in this film on purpose, because I tend to believe that when they were doing the MK Ultra studies, Bluebird, Artichoke, Naomi, which, as far as I can tell, are all real, at least according to John Marks's book, that they really did study the human psyche and how to traumatize it and how to fracture it. I believe that's real. Now, I'm not so convinced that the CIA is out there running all these couriers and assassins or anything like that. I think that the purpose of studying those things was so that through pop culture, they could traumatize the masses, right? That's much more valuable than Scarlett Johansson running around with a trigger code and killing somebody. That's if you can cause a billion people to have double think, that's much more valuable to a social engineer than Mila Jovovich going and then assassinating somebody.
Right.
So anyway, I'm kind of getting off topic, but that's what I see it as. I see it as a retelling of the myth of America from a different perspective, and possession, ghost story, all of that.
Kubrick as well as David Lynch, they do this a lot, and that's playing a lot with the waking dream state. And, I've always wondered, this
surrealism,
is again,
right?
Yeah, and this is, again, my own personal opinion. And I got to go back to in my mid-teens when I guess I stumbled upon the concept of lucid dreaming for the folks that are, believe that it's possible. And that always fascinated me. I've always felt like it was in this sleep, waking dream state, if you will, that the veil is the thinnest and we can experience things outside of our everyday reality. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, Kubrick and Lynch both use this quite a lot in their films. Are they just using this as merely vehicles for plot development, or do you think they are trying to hint at more?
Oh, I absolutely think that more is going on. When you go to the origins of surrealism, they're all a bunch of occultists. Now, I'm not saying that means that every one of them was necessarily evil, but when you look at, say, the art of Man Ray, who is the buddy of George Hodel, who most people think is probably the Black Dahlia killer,
right?
And then this guy's running around in all the elite circles of Hollywood in his day. If you look at the art of Man Ray, there's a really good book called Exquisite Corpse, which it's dedicated to investigating the Black Dahlia situation from the vantage point of art, and particularly analyzing in depth the art of Man Ray. And Man Ray's art is utterly Luciferian and totally anti-human and totally dedicated to bondage, torture, mind control, splitting personalities. That's 100% what his art's about. Very obvious, no question about it. Human sacrifice even. So in that regard, there's somebody who is popular as an artist who, no, surrealism for him is way more than a device for art. It's, for him, it is a very consciously satanic thing. So it just depends, right, on the person's intention. I think that a lot of artists or filmmakers find surrealism fascinating because it is kind of fascinating. I mean, look at Salvador Dali's surrealist art. I mean, it's very fascinating. It's dealing with the dream state and all this kind of stuff. But I think it was George Hodel himself who said that I was fascinated by the idea of there being no distinction between the waking state and the dream state, precisely because it removed all moral obligation.
Wow. Right.
Because, and he, even if he wasn't the Black Dahlia killer, he was like guilty of pedophilia and incest. So, I mean, the guy's a total scumbag, regardless of whether he actually killed Elizabeth Short or not. So it just depends, right? I mean, it depends on but I mean, you could see how easily one could step from surrealism into some kind of, I don't know, idea that, like, I think Carl Jung had this view that everything in your experience is just a manifestation of your psyche. And if that's the case, then, well, it doesn't really matter what you do.
Right.
Because your mind is basically your own God, and you're creating your own reality and all those kind of nonsense. I don't think that that's true. And that's the dangerous part of surrealism. But for others, it could be just merely one artistic creative school or something like that.
It definitely seems like there is somewhat of a thin line. Jay, we're going to take a top of the hour break. If it's all right with you, you mind hanging on the line while we play a couple of songs and then come back in and dive back into your book?
Sure.
Cool. When we return, we're going to talk some more to Jay about his book, Esoteric Hollywood. Man, this first hour just flew by. We're going into deep waters, so grab the scuba gear. We're going to go, we're talking about David Lynch. You liked that one, didn't you? Yeah.
That was pretty good.
I was saving that for
the scuba gear. I haven't heard that one.
We're talking David Lynch, so we're gonna go out with this from the Lost Highway soundtrack. This is a 9-inch nail track, The Perfect Drug. Talk about mind control and whatnot. Right?
Great.
West of the Rockies coming right back.
West of the Rockies with Frank.
Open your mind.
And we're back to the second hour, West of the Rockies. I'm Frank. Thank you guys for sticking around. As always, I'm Engineer Frank on Twitter, West of the Rockies on Facebook, Genevieve UA on Twitter. If you want to learn how to spell that, go to our website, WOTRradio.com. Follow the show on Twitter at WOTR Radio, also on Instagram and all that good stuff. Don't forget to sign up for our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and also our YouTube channel where we post our shows as well as some video interviews. When we get the chance to catch up with some of our guests in person, we like to grab a little quick video interview with them. So you can find that on there. Our guest tonight is Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. Definitely follow him on Twitter if you want to stay up to date with all the craziness. That's at J, J-A-Y, at J_D007 on Twitter, and check out his website, jaysanalysis.com. Mm-hmm. Man, and you need to get this book. Esoteric Hollywood.
I already got it.
You already got one. Yeah. We're fighting over this copy. Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film by Mr. Dyer, who is our guest tonight. You can pick it up on Amazon. And I believe that you can pick a signed copy on Jay's website. Is that correct, Jay? If they order from your website, I believe they can get a signed copy of your book, right?
Yeah, please don't get it from Amazon.
Don't get it. Okay, forget I say get it from Amazon.
That's okay. I mean, Amazon's just not that great for authors, but yeah, if you get it from me from the website, I'll just send you a signed copy. So it's not that much more.
Cool. Jay, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight and talk about all this stuff. Let me ask you something, because before the break, we were talking about The Shining and rituals and whatnots, and we were watching Rosemary's Baby last night. You know, that's such a great family movie, right? You get the kids and watch that thing.
Yep. Get your popcorn out and, wait a minute.
You know, it's funny because talking about The Shining, and, you know, I was just thinking about this during the break. You mentioned how Jack Nicholson's character in The Shining was kind of this bitter individual that felt like fame eluded him. He felt like he deserved to be this successful, famous writer.
He wanted more.
Yeah. In Rosemary's Baby, we see maybe not such a bitter individual, but we see, and I'm sorry, I forget the name of the character and the actor at the moment, but the one of the protagonists, the male counterpart, if you will, he was an actor, and he joined this cult, did this ritual to get ahead in his career. And that's two movies from two different directors. They are kind of alluding to this underground network where in order to get ahead, you got to do some really interesting...
dodgy.
Yeah, activities. Again, do you think they're trying to tell us something in a not so subtle way of how things operate in the entertainment industry?
Yes, and a large portion of that kind of stuff is blackmail. So I did a fairly popular podcast on the subject of Rosemary's Baby maybe 2 months ago. And I think had about 15 or 20,000 plays. So pretty good for a podcast. And if you want to get my full analysis, you can check that out either at the Spreaker page or at the YouTube page. So what I go into there is, yes, we actually do. We do cover that point. The fact that I think his name is Cassavetes. His desire was to be an A-lister, and that's what he finally got through, you know, pretty much doing whatever the cult told him to do, because they actually had a lot of power. And that includes, by the way, murder in this Rosemary's Baby story. They kill the girl who falls out of the window or whatever at the beginning. That was actually a murder. So yes, that I do think goes on, especially when the establishment has their fingers in a lot of different cults and organizations, and to rise up in the ranks of those things, they want to have compromising information on you to ensure that you will go along. And that's a big part of it. That's what the kind of the role of the intelligence agencies and different private intelligence agencies and PIs and surveillance and, you know, with the Franklin cover-up or those kinds of stories we read about, people like Craig Spence and these characters who would wire the parties for orgy blackmail material, because that's worth a lot of money. So yeah, that goes on. And the cults are really, I think, kind of the medium by which this kind of stuff goes down. That's where this stuff goes down, basically, is what I'm trying to say. And yes, you will get indications of that in films. I think I do have an analysis. It didn't make it into the book. It'll be probably in part 2, but I did do an analysis of Roman Polanski's Ninth Gate. In that, if you recall, Johnny Depp's kind of playing this book hunting dude who goes across the globe trying to track down the secrets of this missing book this mysterious book that supposedly the devil wrote, and he gets involved in a cult, and the cult's kind of a bunch of goofballs, and there's a scene that's very reminiscent of Eyes Wide Shut, where he kind of stumbles into this black mass sex magic ritual, very, very, very similar to Eyes Wide Shut. So yeah, I think that Roman Polanski is telling us what's going on. In fact, Roman Polanski, you know, was rumored to be running in these circles. You know, he doesn't live in the U.S. precisely because he was charged with, you know, sex underage or something back in the 70s. So that does go on. And I think these movies are absolutely describing that phenomenon.
Yeah, I'm always interested to think about like how people's history plays into their arts. And I recall watching a very intriguing documentary about Roman Polanski's life. It was biographical documentary. I'm not sure exactly what it was called, but it walks you through his life and how he literally lived through World War II. And obviously that's quite traumatizing. And it reminded me of when James Ellroy, the writer of Black Dahlia, LA Confidential, and, a lot of LA noir novels. I remember when he came to our university back in Cambridge in England, and he gave a talk, and he was talking about, his life and growing up and his mom, and he literally lived through his mother being raped and murdered. And this is the guy that goes on to write novels such as The Black Dahlia and LA Confidential. And you have Roman Polanski on the other side, who lived through his family dying in World War II. And this is the art he comes out with. What do you have to say about that, and how people's backgrounds shape what, they create?
Well, I'm not trying to be an asshole, but I think that's kind of like a no-brainer. I think that everybody who's an artist is going to be informed by their background. So I'm not really sure what to say about that, other than that it's just kind of obvious and a natural process for, especially writers. Writers are going to draw from their own experience. For example, I wrote this book, it's because I love movies and I like watching a lot of movies, and I also like conspiracies and geopolitics, right? So you write about what you know and what you've experienced. I mean, I guess you could argue that these guys have been exposed to the dark side a lot, and so they're probably going to reflect that attempt to grapple with the human dark side and the existence of evil and all that in their artwork. And that could mean either their belief that they're controlling evil, or that they're doing a ritual, or that they're trying to maybe in their own mind establish whether evil's real or not, or I don't know. I'm not actually that well studied on. I've seen a lot of Roman Polanski's movies, even back to like the vampire ones and his older obscure stuff, his foreign stuff. So I'm very familiar with his canon of films. As to him personally, I don't know that much about his story.
We appreciate your answer on that, but yeah, it's interesting.
I'm just always intrigued, like you got to think about people's backgrounds and how they really shape what they're projecting.
I mean, I guess it makes them more prone.
Yes.
And it's always interesting to see like how it ties in.
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes me wonder, and I'm just thinking out loud, if maybe the people behind the scenes maybe saw a young Roman Polanski and they're like, hey, this guy's pretty messed up. We could totally manipulate him or something. We can convince him to join our little group or whatever. But again, that's just pure speculation. Jay, let's get back into the book, because this movie was like a rite of passage for me. And actually, to be fair, there were two movies that I watched almost simultaneously, and they were like my dark side of the moon moment, if you will. One was 2001 Space Odyssey, but we already talked about Kubrick. And honestly, that movie alone could be another show in and of itself. But I want to talk about Close Encounters of the Third Kind, because this movie was like a worldwide hit. My dad played this movie for me when I was very, very young. I think too young to understand, but I guess he felt like he really had to show me, right? Like it was just one of those movies you've seen. And the way my dad interpreted the movie, it was in a very, optimistic type of way, which was aliens or extraterrestrials or these beings from elsewhere. They want to have a peaceful relationship with us. And obviously, Spielberg there's a reason why the man is the legend that he is as far as filmmaking is concerned. And, this movie had it all. It had black ops, conspiracies, secret government bases, aliens and UFOs, everything. It was everything you want in a sci-fi movie. But what was the message? Was it a message of hope? Was this some type of, and I'm going to use the term synchronicity? Were we being groomed and prepared for something? I mean, a lot of people speculated that this movie was almost a way for them being the government or, the powers that be, to prepare us psychologically for the reality that we are, quote unquote, not alone. Was the message a positive one in that movie, or how did you process the information that we were given there?
Well, I guess determining whether it's a positive message would depend on what one believes about extraterrestrials. And I personally don't believe in extraterrestrials. So in that regard, I don't see the message of Close Encounters as positive. I think from Spielberg's perspective, because he apparently does or professes to believe, in aliens and so forth, that what he wanted to do was, I think he's kind of kicking off the modern obsession with it. I mean, obviously there's always been alien movies, but I mean, this one was a pretty big blockbuster. It kind of wowed people at the time, special effects wise, and given that it is a good story, I still think it's a good movie, even though I don't agree with the what I think is the message. I think the darkest part of it is the fact that the overlords take your family members and your children, and they appear to do some sort of genetic modification, and then they give them back to you years later or something.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I don't believe that the elite are using aliens to breed people or anything like that. I do think that if you read this as a kind of allegory, what I usually talk about in terms of aliens is that I think that the psychopathic ruling class tends to kind of view themselves as the way these movies present aliens. They're kind of this cold, calculating, scientifically advanced, quote, different race, and they have no qualms about experimenting on people. This is what we always hear about aliens, right? Well, who is actually doing that? Well, we know that for the last 100 years, the quote scientific establishment and those who believe in scientism, they don't have any qualms about scientifically experimenting on humans. It's even been declassified many times. So that's what I view it as, is if you want to understand it, it's the oligarchs, the scientific technocrats. They're the ones that run the deep state. They're the ones that, for lack of a better term, are, quote, alien. And, that's why you see the Denver airport come up, or the coordinates of the Denver airport come up roughly. That's why you see NORAD, Cheyenne Mountain reference, Lockheed Martin. I mean, this is the deep state, right? This is the military industrial complex. And you even got characters out of the deep state that the Francois Truffaut character is based on. He's supposed to be Jacques Vallée, the famous UFO researcher and DARPA or whatever he worked for. He worked for Stanford Research and worked on the internet. So that's the background to this. And I don't think that it's ET that's visiting us. I think that it's the establishment that uses humanity as an experiment, and that basically, what's that line from The Box, right? The Richard Kelly movie. You are the experiment. I think that Richard Kelly was hinting at that point. I did an analysis of The Box. It didn't actually make it into the book, but you can find that at Jay's analysis. Richard Kelly's the guy that did Donnie Darko, by the way, Southland Tales. And so The Box is a tribute to Kubrick in a way. And the whole point of that movie is that we're all a sociological scientific experiment for the scientistic class. And I think that that's kind of what Spielberg's message is here. But Spielberg also wants it to have a kind of, as you said, yes, a synchro-mystic message to it. And that's why Roy, the Richard Dreyfuss character, he goes through this almost religious conversion.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, he's totally changed by his experiences of synchronicity. And it seems to all be kind of engineered by these, quote, aliens.
You know, it's funny because and you mentioned it in your book as well, that you're not a believer in the alien phenomena as we come to know it. And you actually make an interesting claim about the Roswell incident that I do want to ask you to maybe elaborate a little bit more. And you believe that Roswell was just a disinformation campaign. On what do you base this idea?
Right. Well, the first thing I would say is that the images carting around those gigantic chunks of plastic and metal are goofy and ridiculous. They look like a B-movie set. Secondly, I would say that when you look into the history of the MJ-12 document and the deep state, what you find is that a lot of the people who are in the background are all military intelligence, and they work in psyops and all this kind of stuff. And the people who work in military intelligence and psyops are the first people that you should not believe when they tell you something.
Right.
The job of the spy and the psyop officer and the intelligence spokesperson or whatever is to lie. That's their number one job. And to master the art of lying. And this is just basic military principle. So that those two things, number one, are the reasons why I would not believe them. And then when you actually start to look into the people who really kick off the alien, quote unquote, abduction phenomenon, characters like Mel Adamski, these people are not trustworthy. And in fact, you start to find out that some of their stories actually match up to the science fiction novels of their day. So I don't believe that makes, I think that is very discrediting. And I think that the extraterrestrial mythology is very useful to the deep state as a kind of distraction, as a cover. It covers up for all kinds of things. For example, actual research and development in terms of aerospace technology is covered up through alien gobbledygook and smokescreen nonsense. Now, I do believe that there are fallen angels. I do think that those kinds of things do exist, but I don't think they're like zooming around and, space brothers are visiting us or anything like that. I think that if there's any kind of contact in that regard, it does come through the use of hallucinogens or through religious ceremonies, perhaps, or through ascetic practices, perhaps. I think those are the kinds of means by which people think that they're contacting entities or beings. And in fact, I tend to believe that the deep state has fostered the phenomena of aliens and people believing that they're abducted precisely to promote the mythology of aliens. I think that they want us to believe the Prometheus type story that we are created by alien engineers. And I suspect that when you look at MK, I can't prove this, but this is my theory. When you look at MK Ultra and the similarities between MK Ultra and ritual abuse, and then when you look at the claims of the people who are, quote, abductees, it looks to me like these people, if their stories are true and not just made up wholesale, if their stories are true, then they have been part of some sort of government experiment, and that this then reflects back and perpetuates and propagates the mythology of the abduction into the popular culture.
It's funny that you mentioned that because, man, it must have been around 97, 98. It was like the early days of the internet. And I came across this interesting article from a good friend. Well, he's a good friend of mine now, Ron Patton, who works up there with Clyde on Ground Zero. He wrote this amazing article called Aliens in Demons Clothing. And up until that point, I had never really, connected the two or, thought about the possibility that this could be true. And fast forward sometime later, I found the book Passport to Magonia by Jack Ballet. And he basically said the same thing, that when you look at, and I think you included in your book as well, that when you look at any time these quote unquote aliens make an appearance, a lot of paranormal phenomena happens, what some people would describe as haunting, like things will go on off their own or move on their own or things of that nature. And him in his book, Passport to Magonia, proposed, and I can't remember when that book came out. It must have been like 60s, 70s. He proposed that these are not extraterrestrial beings, but they're like interdimensional beings. Would you say that you...
I don't necessarily have a problem with that view, but I think that Jacques Vallée is somewhat dubious just because of his deep state connections. He's also somebody that we can't fully believe, simply because, again, the people who come out of the deep state are unfortunately the most unreliable.
I see. Let me move on to one of the words in the title of your book is cults. We already talked about sex and some of the symbology, but something about cults that I think people are familiar with, mainly because of a fairly popular show, I think, that has garnered a lot of buzz, is this new Scientology show by Leah Remini called Scientology in the Aftermath. And that has been called a Hollywood cult. Some of the members are John Travolta and Tom Cruise, Juliette Lewis. I mean, it's a pretty interesting list of people. What do you make of Scientology? I mean, L. Ron Hubbard was an interesting guy, and, you know, he wrote a ton of books. And this, you know, they call themselves a religion. I think most of us would call them cults without any hesitation. How are they so rooted in the entertainment industry? And do you see them as a group that has any type of pull in the entertainment industry? Or do you think that the cults that you refer to in your book go deeper than that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you could easily decode the situation with L. Ron Hubbard by just looking at his background in terms of Scientology, in terms of Crowley. And when he graduates from his Crowleyan phase, he goes and starts his own religion, which is what Gerald Gardner did, which is what other individuals who were in the Crowleyan nexus did, is that it kind of becomes a college for starting your own religion, becoming your own cult leader. So that's what I view that as. And Hubbard had deep state connections, and that's quite clearly, I would say, why his organization currently has such influence and wealth, is that it's one of the many means by which you can show, the kinds of connections that I outline in my book. Like, for example, James Cameron and Ridley Scott having a close connection to sitting on the board of NASA, for example, especially with James Cameron. So what does that show? Well, NASA is an Air Force institution, and there they are directly working in tandem with two big Hollywood guys. So same thing with this strange Navy, military, CIA cult. Oh, it just happens to involve all of these high-level Hollywood people. So I don't think it's accidental. It's just speaks to the thesis of the book, which that in itself is not even that controversial. That should be pretty well known by now, I guess. Even if you've seen the documentary Going Clear, I mean, that pretty much bears all that out.
Yeah, living here in LA and driving around, it's you really can't escape Scientology. They have these huge properties here. I mean, they have one of a little street named after L. Ron Hubbard.
They have people throwing flyers at you and like
if you're walking down the street, No, they're pretty dedicated, I guess.
They're pretty hands-on.
But another character that we have discussed on this show and whom I'm morbidly fascinated with, because I feel that he holds a major key as to why the entertainment industry, if you will, might be in the state that it's in. And that is Jack Parsons, who you also mentioned on the book. People can check out a really fascinating interview that we did on the subject of Jack Parsons and his work. He was intimately related to L. Ron Hubbard, and a friend of mine who wrote this book called Devil's Gate. He was being interviewed for a TV program, and he said something really interesting that I want to run by you, Jay, and get your opinion on. I believe you're familiar with the Babylon working ritual that Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard did. And if folks are not hip to that, Definitely Google it. Believe me, we're not making this stuff up. It's going to sound outrageous, but we're not making this stuff up. It was a pretty elaborate ritual. I believe it was carried out over a few months. And F.J. Lennon, who wrote this book, Devil's Gate, in an interview, he said that he felt that this ritual, this Babylon working ritual, did open a portal. And it was basically the beginning of the end, I guess. And I'm paraphrasing poorly, I will admit. But the gist of it was that opening this portal here in Southern California, in Pasadena, that's where, the spirit of Babylon came in. And this is why we have this kind of occult culture in the entertainment industry. Obviously, as you mentioned, L. Ron Hubbard went on to start his own religion. So many bands and famous people were influenced by Crowley, who was also in communications with Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard. So do you think that possibly Jack Parsons, L. Ron Hubbard, Crowley, this ritual is the reason why we have, as you labeled it in your book, an esoteric Hollywood?
No, I mean, you could look at Kenneth Anger's Hollywood Babylon to see that the Babylonian aspects of Hollywood precede Crowley and Parsons. And you could also look at German Expressionism, as I cover in the Hitchcock chapter, which was self-consciously satanic as well. And then that would later influence Hollywood directors such as Hitchcock. So, I guess he's British, but Hitchcock obviously influenced a lot of American directors. So, yeah. I mean, you can also read Kieran Connolly's book, Dark History of Hollywood, where he outlines some of the same material, but more from a kind of scandal tabloid type perspective whereas I talk about more of the esoteric stuff. But no, I don't think that the ritual itself is the cause of some sort of Babylonian gate opening or something like that, because again, all this stuff was already in Hollywood prior to them. And if you look at the way that they read the book of Revelation or the quote apocalypse, Crowley thought that you could reinterpret this whole text to be some kind of Gnostic magic ritual. And I've actually done textual studies for many years on the apocalypse, book of Revelation, and that's just not what that book is. John's writing a book to 7 churches in his day about the coming destruction of Jerusalem, which happened in 70 AD. So I think that's what that book is about. It's not about Aleister Crowley and Jack Parsons having sex with his mom and opening up dimensional portals.
Gotcha.
Now they might have been all tripped out on acid and thought that or something, but that doesn't mean that it's so, in my view.
I always found that to be kind of like an unholy trinity of sorts: Crowley, Parsons, and Hubbard. It's like, how did those three got together? That's
well, he would argue that about the women, right? Like Marjorie Cameron or whoever, that's supposed to be the Scarlet Woman, and then one of them is going to be the Beast, and they're going to create the unholy trinity and all this nonsense. But I mean, if they had given birth to the Antichrist or something, then he would already be 60.
Yeah.
So it's the geriatric Antichrist is going to
he slept on that apocalypse, that's for sure.
He's gonna sit on a giant golden wheelchair.
That would be great.
Rule the world.
Jay, we're on the home stretch. Let me ask you this, because I feel, and I'm going to take a bit of a liberty here, and I feel like we're entering a new age of entertainment, and I'll clarify what I'm trying to say by that. A huge hit last year was Stranger Things, the original series from Netflix.
Yes, actually, by the way, I did an analysis of that went viral. So yes, you can find that at Jay's Analysis.
Very cool. Check that out, jasonanalysis.com. What I want to ask you is, the reason why I call it a new age of entertainment is because the way this show was put together was basically more or less through an algorithm, right? Like Netflix looked at viewing patterns of their subscribers. They had all this data, and more or less, granted it's not so simple, right? But more or less a computer told them everything from what the logo should look like to what the storyline should include. And it was a hit people loved it. Everyone loved it. One of the things that I think the reason why Spielberg movies are so popular is because they're multi-generational, right? You have characters that kids can relate to. You have characters that like the older folks can relate to, and you have characters that, the baby boomer generation can relate to. And this formula has worked for him every time. And I see a lot of that in Stranger Things. But to me, what's fascinating in a way is that this was all done using just data. And they crafted more or less the perfect story because, well, hey, how many people watched it on the first week? It was like in the millions. So as we enter this age of computers and algorithms, what can we expect from Hollywood? Are these stories going to continue to be these little windows into what's really going on, or are they going to become bigger propaganda machines? Are they going to be brainwashing vehicles for the masses? How is this going to affect how we are entertained from here on out?
Yeah, the Netflix CEO did a interview. This was in an article a few weeks ago. You can find it on Google somewhere. I forget where it was, but he was saying basically that the future of entertainment is a combination of virtual reality and pharmaceutical enhancement.
Wow.
So you will literally be taking some sort of soma right out of Brave New World as you put your VR headset on. So, and that's interesting. Yeah. So they will probably combine, through AI and different algorithms, these sort of concocted plots. And they will absolutely have propaganda and social engineering embedded in them because that has been going on since the beginning of the camera and film. So all they've done is perfect that technique. And that's exactly what we can expect in the near future. I mean, there's always going to be, the full length feature film that's not going away. Just like radio didn't go away when, film came about.
Right.
So, books are still around. Books haven't completely gone away. So I don't think any of these things are totally going to disappear, but I think they would definitely like to. I just don't know how easy or successful that could be. I mean, you have Fahrenheit 451 and these different stories that have predicted the end of books. And
I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah.
People love books too much. I'm sorry, but
I think do. So. Yeah. So it could be a thing though, where they maybe if they dumb down a giant section of the population who will only be kind of entranced by their VR sets and their Soma or whatever, and then you'll have like another sort of maybe an elite group or something like that, or the bourgeoisie or something. Maybe that they have enough money to afford books or something. I don't know what's going to happen, but I mean, they would definitely like to get everybody into that matrix for sure. The pod, right? They promote this kind of stuff of getting in these pods and basically like the Matrix.
Yeah, pretty much.
Exactly.
Pretty much. Let me ask you this as we wind down. How should we view guys like, Kubrick or David Lynch, who give us, like I said, this peek behind the curtain in a way? Should we view them as prophets warning us of what's going on? Are they trying to maybe lessen their guilt that they may be part of some of these occult groups and practices? How do you view directors such as these and the work that they put out?
Well, I try to avoid implicating and judging people's motives because that's very difficult to do. So a lot of people ask me what was Kubrick's motive. I don't really know. You can interviews where Vivian Kubrick talks about it. She, if I recall, speaks well of her father. So I don't really know. I mean, I don't know anybody in that orbit. So I've never met any of these directors or talked to them. So, I would like to think that and hope that, there's some good motivation there. But then again, I just don't know. My focus was, film interpretation and film symbolism. It wasn't really a question of, David Lynch's life story or anything like that. So I'm just interested in what I can derive from their film presentations.
Do you find that you still enjoy watching movies, or, as soon as you sit down, does your brain just kind of switch into that mode? Are
you basically able to like sit back and relax nowadays watching movies, or are you always on analysis mode?
Pretty much always in analysis mode, and that would be because we are the television show that we're going to do with me and Jay Wiedner has been greenlit.
Oh, very cool.
Great.
Yeah, and so
that's
this last week, I've had a couple conversations with a guy who's a two-time Emmy-winning director from the Travel Channel.
Great.
That's really cool.
And he's gonna be directing the show. So we had to do a couple calls and try to kind of get the show organized. So we picked, I think, the first 15 episodes, and we're sketching that out. So basically what that means is that in any time that I'm watching, quote, movies for the foreseeable future, it's going to be directed and related to that. So, we're looking at the Alien series. We're looking at Ridley Scott. We're looking at Blade Runner. We're looking at AI, Minority Report, True Detective.
Mm-hmm.
All these kinds of things are kind of what I'm swimming in. So
has that taken any of the joy of movie watching away from you?
No, not at all, because for me, it's always kind of been that way. I've always been, I have a very, very analytical mind. So I'm usually, playing movie detective.
Very cool.
And I guess I'd like to finish off with, what's your favorite movie, if you had to pinpoint one, if you can, only if you can, as pertains to, all these esoteric themes. If you had to pick one, what's the one that's up there in terms of out there-ness and weirdness, and you just love it?
Honestly, I can't. I mean, I have just sort of favorites in different genres. So, there's certain espionage films I really like. There's certain sci-fi films I really like. I like most of the directors that I picked in the book. I do like their movies, just solely on an entertainment artistic level. If you can set aside, the propaganda or whatever, I tend to like most of those guys for sure. I like a lot of Terry Gilliam movies. I like 12 Monkeys a lot. I like most Hitchcock movies. I like
all the weird stuff, right?
Yeah, Kubrick stuff. I mean, it's about half and half. Half of it, it's kind of hard to like. I can't rewatch Full Metal Jacket. It's a very, very brutal movie. So that's not like a favorite.
Agree.
But
like there are some movies that I just, I enjoy them, but they're not rewatchable ones.
Well, for me, the Passion of the Christ was up there for me. It's like, I don't think I can watch that thing all over again.
Well, like, I go back to a lot of 80s movies just because they're fun, like Goonies or Star Wars or that kind of stuff, just because it's fun.
Feel good movies,
yeah. Bond movies are always fun.
Let me ask you this.
We'll have to chat about that over a beer sometime, just like movies.
Yeah. If, I don't know if you have kids or not, but if you do,
I don't know.
Okay. If you had children, would you be okay with them watching movies, or would you let them watch movies and then kind of break it down for them?
I would think I would make an informed decision based on what was appropriate for whatever the age group is. Yeah. So, I do not having kids, I can't really say, but it would just have to depend on, how old they were and what the subject matter was.
Yeah, no, I wonder, because I'm torn in this a lot of times where, I don't have children either, knock on wood, for a long time. I wonder how I would react, because obviously right now I find this, like I said, and I said it numerous times, and I'm not, shy about it. I'm morbidly fascinated by all of this. But for the folks at home that have kids,
yeah, well,
the question is there, right? Do I want to expose him to this stuff if it's really that bad?
Actually, I get an email probably once a week at least from parents asking me these kinds of questions. And I don't really feel competent to answer, except for the fact that because I don't follow kids stuff. Like I don't really watch any kids programming or.
Oh, you don't? I do it all the time.
Ignore her.
I mean, I think maybe I saw one of the Pixar movies like 5 years ago. That might have been the last kid movie, or maybe Big Six. I think one of those Pixars. I saw that one, but that was like the first one. So I don't really know what's out there. But what I see in terms of the kid stuff is kind of mind blowing. Like it's very
bizarre.
Yes, very bizarre. Not stuff that I would, if I had a kid, I would not want them watching it. So, I would tend to say that, but I don't even know that stuff or follow it to even say. So,
Jay, we're out of time. Why don't you tell people where they can get your book? Because I'm sure folks will love to get it, and definitely with a signed copy, that's even better. And where they can follow you on social media.
Yeah, if you go to jaysanalysis.com, no apostrophe, you'll see at the top there's a tab to order the book. There's also image graphics that you'll see for purchasing a signed copy, and a very easy process. It's all PayPal there. You can get them inside and outside the U.S., 2 different PayPal tabs. I can mail them outside the U.S., but it does cost a little bit more, just to warn you. But I also offer talks, podcasts, lectures, and interviews as well at my site for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. And that covers everything from geopolitics to philosophy to literature to history to the esoteric, you name it. So I try to do a scholarly approach in audio form as well, and branching out, doing more video lately, actually. So
very cool.
So that's all at Jay's Analysis, and the links for Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and all that are included in every post at Jay's Analysis. So very easy to find anything like that.
Very cool. Jay, what can I say? It has been another great show. You're always full of very, very important and really mind-opening information.
Thanks, man.
I definitely want to encourage people to check out his website, jaysanalysis.com. Get the book. Believe me, it's money well spent. I almost see it
on Twitter at J_D007. Jay's Analysis. Just Google it. You'll find him online everywhere.
Yeah. Jay, thank you so much. And we hope to have you back again soon in the future to talk more about the secret language that we find in film. It's been truly fascinating.
Anytime.
Awesome. Have a great night, Jay. We really appreciate it. That was Jay Dyer. Man, it was, I enjoyed talking to Jay so much.
Jam-packed show.
I was literally racking my head before the show how we're going to fit all of these points in 2 hours.
Just so much to talk about.
That we tried to move through them.
My mind is so convoluted right now.
Yeah, so definitely go and pick up his book, Esoteric Hollywood. The website is jaysanalysis.com. Check out the reviews on Amazon if you don't believe me. I mean, people are saying great things about this book. I can attest that it's a very well-written research book. So yeah, definitely check it out. As always, I'm Engineer Frank on Twitter, West of the Rockies on Facebook. Don't forget to follow the show on Twitter at WOTR Radio, and sign up on YouTube. You can subscribe there. And we're going to go out with a little Jay's Addiction. How's that? Some Jay's Addiction.
Jay's Addiction?
Jay's. Yeah, Jay's Addiction, which is movies, apparently. Shout out to Jay once again, jaysanalysis.com. This is Jay's Addiction. We'll see you next week, guys. Take care. Be safe. God bless. Don't do anything too crazy. Bye-bye.
West of the Rockies with Frank the Engineer on the Independent FM, Los Angeles.